The night my brother killed a man, my parents did not ask if I was okay. They asked if I was willing to take the blame for him. I still remember that moment clearly. The red and blue lights of police cars and ambulances swept across the road like cold blades. The air was thick with the smell of burned rubber, gasoline, and a metallic scent I had never known how to name until that night. I stood at the intersection of East Camelback Road and North 44th Street, Phoenix, Arizona, and watched a white sheet being pulled over a motionless body on the pavement. That person no longer moved, no longer breathed, no longer belonged to this world. My brother Ethan stood a few steps away from me. His face was pale. His hands trembled uncontrollably. The smell of alcohol clung to his breath even as he tried to turn his head away. His eyes could not look at the white sheet, and they could not look at me either. He stared only at his dust-covered shoes and the dark oil stains beneath his feet, as if staring long enough might make everything disappear. I am Ryder Cole, Ethan's older brother, the son my family had always considered stable, able to endure, and, if necessary, expendable. I knew that long before the accident, but it was not until that moment that I truly understood what it meant. The police were still securing the scene. They had not asked me any questions yet. They had not asked Ethan any questions either. Everything was still in chaos, when the truth had not yet taken shape. I looked around and saw my father, Richard Cole, speaking quietly with a police officer at the edge of the scene. His voice was low, calm to the point of coldness. There was no panic, no grief. Only the familiar calculation I had seen my entire life. My mother Margaret stood beside the ambulance, her hands tightly clasped together. She was crying, but it was a restrained kind of crying, as if she were afraid that if she cried too loudly, everything would shatter. When her eyes met mine, I did not see concern for me. I saw pleading and fear. I had not even opened my mouth when my father walked toward me. He did not look at me right away. He looked at Ethan first, then turned to me. "Ryder," he said, his voice low and quick. "You've had trouble with the law before. This can be handled." I understood immediately what he meant, even though he did not finish the sentence. My heart pounded, but my mind went strangely cold. I looked at Ethan. He finally looked up, his eyes red and full of panic. He shook his head slightly, as if begging me without daring to say the words. I did not know who the man under the white sheet was. Did he have a family? Children? Someone waiting for him to come home tonight? Those questions flashed through my mind briefly, then were pushed aside, because my family was standing right in front of me, and they had already begun making their choice. My father stepped closer, close enough that only I could hear him. "Ethan was drunk," he said. "If he gets arrested, everything is over. But you can carry this." No one said the words, "Take the blame." They did not need to. Everyone understood. I looked at my mother. She avoided my eyes. Her silence weighed heavier than any words. I stood there, surrounded by flashing lights, sirens, and police radios. And for the first time in my life, I felt that I no longer belonged to this family. Not because I did not love them, but because I realized they were willing to erase me to save someone else. The police began to approach. They were about to ask questions, about to demand statements. My father placed his hand on my shoulder, a gesture that looked like comfort but was really restraint. "You're the older brother," he said. "You understand." I took a deep breath. The cold air burned my throat. I looked at the white sheet one last time. Then I looked at my family. In that moment, I understood that whatever decision I made that night would not only change my life, it would define who I was for the rest of it. I had not said yes, but I had not said no either, and it was that silence that opened a path I would never be able to turn back from. They did not threaten me. They only reminded me that family always comes before the truth. 24 hours after the accident, I sat in the living room of our house in the suburbs of Phoenix. The room was so familiar that I could close my eyes and know every scratch on the wooden table, every picture frame on the wall. But that day, it felt foreign. The doors were shut. The curtains were drawn tight. The air was heavy, as if there was no room for the truth to exist. My father sat at the end of the sofa, his back straight, his hands clasped together. My mother sat beside him, her eyes red, a tissue clenched tightly in her hand. Ethan sat across from me, his head lowered, his shoulders slumped like a child who had made a mistake too big to fix. Before I could say anything, my father spoke. He did not beat around the bush. "Ryder," he said, "we need to have a serious conversation." The way he emphasized the word "we" made it clear that this conversation left no room for personal choice. He talked about consequences, about how if Ethan were charged with drunk driving causing death, his future would be over. Education, career, everything. He spoke as if reading a report, without emotion, without hesitation. Then he talked about me, that I had been in trouble before, that my record was not clean, that if I stepped forward and took responsibility, things would be easier to handle. My mother interrupted, her voice trembling. "You're the older brother," she said. "You're stronger. You can endure it." She cried, but her tears did not comfort me. They made me feel as though I was being pushed, step by step, into a corner with no escape. Ethan said nothing. He just sat there in silence, as if his silence were proof of remorse. But I did not hear an apology. I did not hear a single, "Don't do this for me." His silence was not resistance. It was acceptance. I asked a question I already knew would hurt. If I were the one who caused the accident, I looked directly at my parents. "Would you ask Ethan to do this?" No one answered right away. My father looked down at the table. My mother turned her face away. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but to me, it felt like a sentence being passed. In that moment, I understood exactly where I stood in this family. My father finally spoke. "You understand," he said. "This is for the family." He did not say, "for Ethan." He said, "for the family." But I knew exactly who he was trying to save. Something inside me broke. Not in an explosive burst of anger, but in a deep, simmering disappointment. I realized that for a long time, I had always been the one expected to sacrifice. Sacrifice time, sacrifice emotion, and now, my entire life. They began to talk about what they would do for me if I agreed. The best lawyer. Compensation would be taken care of. They would not abandon me. My mother grabbed my hand and sobbed. "I promise," she said. "I won't leave you alone." I looked at her hand. I believed that she believed what she was saying. But I also knew that belief has no value in a courtroom. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the Phoenix sun blazed, completely indifferent to what was happening inside that room. I thought about the man who had died. I thought about his family. And I thought about how, if I stayed silent, the truth would be buried forever. When I turned back, I spoke very slowly. "If I do this," I said, "everything has to be clear." My father raised an eyebrow. "Clear how?" he asked. I looked straight at him. In writing, the room went completely silent. I knew I had just changed the game. I had not agreed. But I was no longer the son who simply nodded his head. That night, when I left the house, I understood that the choice between family and court was no longer an abstract question. It was a path I was about to be forced to walk, whether I wanted to or not. I said I would do it, but not the way they wanted. 2 days after the conversation in the living room, we sat in the family lawyer's office in downtown Phoenix. The building was tall and cold, with glass walls reflecting the harsh desert sunlight. Inside, there was no sense of family, no familiar emotion. Only the smell of paper, printer ink, and constantly running air conditioning. This was not a place to beg. This was a place to finalize agreements. The lawyer was a middle-aged man with an even voice and eyes that showed no opinion. He did not ask whether we were right or wrong. He only asked what we wanted to do and how to make it stand in court. I realized quickly that in this room, truth weighed less than a signature. My father sat beside me, back straight, hands resting on his knees. My mother sat slightly behind, as if she wanted to be present but not directly involved. Ethan sat across from us, his hands clenched together, his eyes constantly flicking toward the door, as if he were searching for an escape no one else could see. The lawyer explained the process, the plea, the statement, The legal risks. He spoke in the tone of someone accustomed to turning tragedy into paperwork. I listened, but my mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about the conversation the day before, about my mother's averted gaze, about Ethan's silence, and about the clear feeling that if I did not protect myself right now, no one else would. When the lawyer asked if I was willing to cooperate, I nodded. But before my father could sigh in relief, I added one more sentence. I have a condition. The room paused. My father turned to look at me, slightly surprised. The lawyer raised an eyebrow, signaling for me to continue. I kept my voice calm. All commitments must be put in writing. Everything. My father frowned. We're family, he said. There's no need to. I need it, I interrupted, not loudly but clearly. If I'm putting my life on the line, I need to know exactly what I'm getting in return. The lawyer did not object. He simply nodded, as if this were a completely reasonable request. He asked what I wanted included in the agreement. I listed each item slowly, carefully. A defense attorney paid for by the family. All civil compensation related to the accident. Financial support for me throughout my sentence. And a specific sum of money after my release. Enough for me to start over without having to return and ask anything from anyone in that room. My mother began to cry. She said I was making everything too cold, that this was not how family treated each other. I looked at her and said nothing. I knew that if I spoke, I would say something no one wanted to hear. Ethan finally spoke. His voice was small and hoarse. You don't have to do this, he said, but he did not look at me. The words came too late and too weak. If he truly did not want me to do this, he would have said so from the beginning. The lawyer began drafting the document. The steady sound of the keyboard filled the silent room. I watched the lines appear on the screen, sentence by sentence, and felt a strange sense of calm. This was the first time since the night of the accident that I felt I had any control. The lawyer handed me a copy. My father reached for it, but I held it tight. This copy is mine, I said. He looked at me for a second, then nodded. Perhaps he thought it was only a formality, a procedure to reassure me. When we left the office, the Phoenix sun was as bright as ever. There was no sign that an agreement had just been signed, that a life had just been exchanged. But I knew. And I also knew that the paper I was holding was not just a promise. It was evidence. I had not yet pleaded guilty, but from that moment on, I was preparing for the day I would. Not because I trusted them, but because I trusted no one at all. The day I walked into the courtroom, I knew there was no turning back. The Maricopa County Courthouse stood before me like a massive block of concrete, cold and indifferent. The long hallways echoed with footsteps and the whispers of strangers. No one knew who I was. No one knew I had once been a son, a brother, or a person with other choices. To them, I was just a defendant about to stand before the bench. The prosecutor stood and began presenting the case. His voice was clear and methodical, listing every detail of the accident like lifeless numbers. Time, location, speed, blood alcohol level. I heard my name spoken, attached to actions I had never committed. Each sentence felt like another layer of earth being thrown over a buried truth. There was a very brief moment, just before I had to say the final words. I thought about the paper locked away in the small safe I had rented, where the copy of the agreement was stored. I thought about the man who had died, about his family, and about how they would never know the full truth. I also thought about Ethan, and about how he would walk out of this courtroom with the freedom I was about to lose. Does the defendant plead guilty or not guilty? The judge asked. The room went silent. I could hear my heart beating in my ears. I did not turn to look at my family. I stared straight ahead. I plead guilty, I said. The sound of the gavel struck, sharp and final. In that moment, it felt as though a door had slammed shut behind me. Not the door of the courtroom, but the door leading back to the person I used to be. 2 officers approached. They instructed me to stand and turn around. The cold metal of the handcuffs closed tightly around my wrists. That sensation made everything more real than any words ever could. I was no longer free. As they led me out of the courtroom, I finally looked back at my family. My mother was crying. Ethan looked up, his eyes full of panic and guilt. My father looked at me for a brief second, then turned away. There was no thank you, no apology, only heavy silence. The long hallway appeared before me again. Each step carried me farther from that room, and farther from the life I had once known. I did not shout. I did not resist. I simply walked, carrying the truth no one else wanted to bear. When the metal door closed behind me, I understood that my sentence was not just the years I would spend in prison. It was that I had signed my own disappearance. And that was only the beginning. Prison taught me one thing very quickly. No one truly disappears. People simply choose to leave. The first days at Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence passed slowly and heavily. Everything smelled of old metal, sweat, and disinfectant. The sound of steel doors opening and closing echoed all day, a constant reminder that I no longer controlled my time. I learned how to stand in line, how to stay quiet, how not to look at anyone for too long. In here, every stare could be a challenge. I did not tell anyone my real story. In prison, the truth does not protect you. It only makes you a target. I said I caused a drunk driving accident. No one asked more. No one cared. Everyone carried their own version of guilt, and there was no room for anyone else's story. During the first weeks, my family still called. Not often, but enough for me to believe the agreement was still in effect. My mother asked how I was eating. My father asked if I needed more money. Ethan said very little, only a few short sentences, as if every word spoken to me made him uncomfortable. I reminded myself that this was the price I had accepted. I did not expect gratitude. I only expected them to keep their word. Then the calls began to fade. Letters arrived more slowly. Sometimes I went an entire week without receiving anything. When I called home, sometimes no one answered. When someone did, the conversations were always rushed. I heard the television in the background, the normal sounds of a family that had continued its life without me in it. The financial support started arriving late as well. At first, it was just a few days, then a few weeks. When I asked, I was told there were banking issues, that everything would be fine. I wanted to believe it. I needed to believe it. But in prison, you learn how to recognize promises that are slowly becoming empty. One evening, I stood in the phone area and heard my mother's voice on the other end of the line. She said she was tired. She said things were difficult. She said I needed to be patient. I held the receiver, staring at the gray wall in front of me, and realized that for the first time in my life, I was no longer her priority. Perhaps I never had been. The following month, I received no money, no explanation. I wrote letters, no reply. I called, no one answered. At night, I lay on my hard bunk and stared at the ceiling, where the fluorescent light never fully turned off. I thought about the agreement, about the signatures, and about how none of it mattered in this place where you lived behind bars. I heard news about my family through fragments. A relative visiting someone in my unit mentioned that Ethan had returned to school, that he was trying to live normally. I did not feel jealous. I felt hollow, as if a part of my life had been exchanged for someone else's peace, and that exchange had become something everyone accepted. One day I realized that it had been more than 2 months since anyone in my family had contacted me. No calls, no letters, no money, no apology, no explanation. That silence was not accidental. It was a choice. I sat in the yard, looking up at the Arizona sky, blindingly blue. It was the same sky above the house I once lived in, but the distance between us was impossible to cross. I understood that my family had moved on, and to do that, they needed me to disappear. That night I returned to my cell and took out a small piece of paper. I began to write. Not a letter home. I wrote for myself. I recorded every detail I could remember. The day the agreement was signed, the clauses, the words spoken in the lawyer's office. I did not know then how I would use these things. I only knew that if I did not hold on to the truth, no one else would. That was the night I stopped waiting, stopped hoping, stopped believing that my sacrifice would be repaid with loyalty. I was still in prison. I was still serving my sentence. But something had changed. I was no longer the abandoned man waiting for a phone call. I became an observer, and in the silence of prison, I began preparing for the day I would no longer be silent. The man who changed everything in prison was not a lawyer. He was serving time. I met Marcus Hale on a hot afternoon in the common area. He was much older than me, his hair already streaked with gray, his frame thin but his eyes sharp and alert. We sat at opposite ends of a scratched metal table, each of us with a tray of cold food in front of us. We did not speak right away. In prison, silence is the safest language. Marcus spoke first. He asked how long I had been inside. I answered. He nodded, as if marking a timeline in his head. Then he asked about my charge. I gave the same version I gave everyone. A drunk driving accident. He looked at me a little longer, did not react, just nodded again. A few days later, we sat at the same table again. This time, Marcus asked a different question. Did you actually drive? He asked quietly, softly enough that no one around us noticed. I did not answer right away. I looked down at my food tray. In that moment, I calculated quickly. Telling the truth in prison is a risk. But there was something in the way he asked that made me feel he was not looking for a story, but for structure. I pleaded guilty, I said finally. But I didn't drive. Marcus did not look surprised. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. I thought so, he said. Your paperwork doesn't look like that of a typical drunk driver. He said he had once worked as a paralegal. He was used to reading files, spotting inconsistencies, and understanding how the legal system operates when no one is watching. He did not ask why I did it. He only asked whether I had kept anything. I have a copy of the agreement, I said. Not with me, but I remember every clause. Marcus tilted his head, his eyes focused. Paper doesn't die, he said. People do. But paper doesn't. In the days that followed, we talked more. Not constantly, but in short segments, scattered, the way inmates share important things. I told him the entire story, from the night of the accident to the day I pleaded guilty. I did not embellish. I did not soften anything. I just said what had happened. Marcus listened, occasionally asking very specific questions. The signing date. Who signed first? Who was present? What words were used in the agreement? I was surprised to realize how clearly I remembered everything. Marcus explained that what I had signed was not meaningless. While it could not erase my criminal conviction, it could open other paths, civil, liability, and most importantly, leverage. You didn't just take the fall, he said. You documented the entire crime. That thought kept me awake many nights. I lay on my bunk, listening to the breathing of the other men in the cell, and thought about how truth could exist alongside my sentence. I had believed everything ended when the courtroom door closed. Marcus made me realize there were other doors, quiet ones, harder to see, but still there. He made no promises. He did not say I would definitely win. He only said I needed to be ready. Ready to remember. Ready to be patient. Ready to survive until the day I could walk out and speak to a lawyer who had no connection to my family. From that day on, I began to observe everything differently. I stopped counting only the days. I started remembering dates and times. The times my family did not call. The times the money did not come. The small details I had once thought meaningless. I understood that in the outside world, those details could become evidence. Marcus and I did not become friends in the usual sense. We did not share personal lives or deep emotions. But he gave me something I had not had since the day I pleaded guilty. Direction. Not an immediate escape, but a possibility. The day Marcus was transferred to another facility, he shook my hand quickly. Don't waste the time you still have alive, he said. You've already paid enough. When he left, the common area returned to its usual noise. But inside me, there was a new stillness. I was still in prison. My sentence had not changed. My family was still silent. But I was no longer blind. For the first time since the night of the accident, I was not just enduring. I was preparing. The day I was released, no one came to get me. The steel gate opened slowly, making the familiar dry sound. I stepped outside with a small bag in my hand, holding only a few old clothes and the documents I had signed over the years. There were no arms waiting, no smiles, no family standing in the parking lot. Only the Phoenix sun beating down, harsh and indifferent, as always. I stood there for a few minutes, not sure what I was waiting for. Perhaps it was an old habit, a part of me still hoping that someone might appear at the last second. But nothing happened. I turned my back on the prison and walked toward the nearest bus stop. The Greyhound bus carried me back into the city. Through the window, I watched familiar streets pass by, but it felt like I was looking at a place I had never lived. Everything was still there, but I no longer belonged to it. I wondered if my family knew today was the day I was released. And if they did, whether it would make any difference. I got off the bus at the Central Phoenix station. People moved around me, each carrying their own lives. I stood among them, legally free, but completely alone. I checked my phone. No missed calls. No messages. The silence no longer surprised me. It simply confirmed what I had known for a long time. I rented a cheap room near the station. The room was small, smelled of dampness, but it was quiet. On my first night sleeping on a bed without bars, I could not sleep. I lay staring at the ceiling, listening to cars pass outside, and felt the strange difference between freedom and safety. I had been released, but I did not yet know where I was going. The next morning, I took out the stack of papers I had kept for years. The copy of the agreement, the notes I had written in prison, the list of dates, unanswered calls, money that never arrived. I arranged them carefully, page by page, as if assembling a picture I had started long ago. I looked for a lawyer with no connection to my family. A small office, no flashy sign, located in an old building. The man sitting across from me listened without interrupting. I showed him the documents. I did not add anything. I only answered when asked. He read very slowly, turned each page, sometimes stopping to examine a detail. The room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioner. Finally, he looked up at me. "If this goes public," he said, "your family won't be able to control the consequences." I did not feel satisfaction hearing that. I only felt tired. "I didn't come here for revenge," I said. "I came here to stop lying." The lawyer nodded. He talked about the next steps, about the possibility of a civil lawsuit, about how what I had could force others to answer questions they had avoided for years. I listened, but my thoughts drifted to my family, to how they would react when they realized I had not disappeared the way they wanted. That afternoon, I walked through the city. I passed cafes, shops, houses with lights on inside. I saw families eating dinner, talking, laughing, arguing over small things. I did not feel jealous. I only felt that I was standing outside a world I once thought was mine. When the sun set, I returned to the room. I sat on the bed and picked up my phone. For the first time since my release, I called my family on my own. No one answered. I put the phone down and did not call again. I no longer needed them to confirm my existence. That night, I signed the first documents with my new lawyer. There was no shouting, no drama, just calm signatures, much like the day I signed the agreement in the family lawyer's office. But this time, I knew who I was signing for. When I turned off the light and lay down, I no longer wondered whether I was doing the right thing. I only knew that for the first time since the night of the accident, I was walking a path I had chosen myself. I had come back, and I would not disappear again. The truth did not arrive like an explosion. It came slowly, steadily, and could not be stopped. The weeks that followed passed in tense silence. My lawyer worked behind the scenes, sending letters, filing documents, asking questions my family had avoided for years. I did not appear in the media. I did not speak publicly. I simply continued living in the small rented room, taking temporary jobs, and waiting. I was used to waiting. This time, I waited with purpose. The first call from my family came late one evening. My father's number appeared on the screen. I watched it ring for a few seconds before answering. His voice on the other end was no longer as steady as before. He asked what I was doing. I told him I was living. He was silent for a long time. Then he said I had gone too far. I did not argue. I only said I had gone exactly as far as they had pushed me out of the family. The call ended without a goodbye. Other calls followed. From my mother. From distant relatives I had hardly spoken to in years. Some begged. Some accused. Some said I was destroying the family. I listened to all of it and then hung up. I did not need to explain anymore. I had already explained through silence for many years. As the matter began to appear in civil filings, old questions resurfaced. Who was driving that night? Why was there a financial agreement among family members right before the criminal trial? Why was the person who pleaded guilty not the one who benefited most from the situation? Those questions did not need me to answer them. They existed on their own, and they were large enough that no one could ignore them. Ethan was summoned to meet with lawyers. I was not in that room. I did not need to be. I heard that he looked exhausted, anxious, and no longer carried the confidence he once had. For the first time, he had to face the consequences of a night he had tried to forget. My family tried to negotiate. They offered money. They offered private settlements. They talked about keeping things quiet. I refused. Not because I wanted them to suffer, but because if I agreed, I would continue lying, and I had lived in that long enough. The process dragged on. Not fast, not loud, but step by step, the truth was peeled away from the shell my family had built around it. I did not feel joy. I did not celebrate. Each time there was a new development, I felt only a quiet relief, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from my chest. When things were nearly finished, I received notice of a civil settlement. Not a number that would make anyone rich, but enough for me to stand on my own. Enough that I did not have to return to the house where I had been asked to disappear. I did not meet my family again. Not because I could not, but because I did not need to. I knew they would have to live with what they had done, just as I had lived with my decision. Justice is not always prison. Sometimes, it is simply the inability to return to life as if nothing happened. One morning I walked under the Phoenix sky. It was clear, the sunlight gentle. I thought about the man who had died. I thought about how he deserved the truth, even if it came late. And I thought about myself, the man who had carried a truth that did not belong to him for many years. I do not see myself as a hero. I do not see myself as a perfect victim either. I am simply someone who stopped disappearing for others. Someone who chose to stand still and let the truth do its work. I did not destroy my family. They were broken by their own choices. When I look ahead, I do not see revenge. I do not see victory. I see only an open road where I can walk with my own name. And for the first time, that is enough.